those of us that have reported from war zones often get called brave. I'd suggest that Jamal had a different kind of bravery. He'd become the most prominent Saudi commentator, and he never shied away from the difficult questions. He was fair, he was honest. When the phone rang from Al Jazeera, he could have just said he was busy. Maybe he should have. But instead, he came on to Al Jazeera, and despite the crackdown, despite Qatar and the Saudis now being sworn enemies, said what he thought about MBS. He said whether he thought he was doing a good job or a bad job. But he didn't not speak, he didn't not turn up. And that, in my world, is a pretty brave thing to do. So how do we honour that bravery? How do we honour his sacrifice? Well, I'll just quote one of his very last article in the Washington Post, when he talked about his friend, the prominent Saudi writer Salah al-Shahi, being thrown in prison. He talked about how the Egyptian authorities had shut down the whole print run of the newspaper Masri al-Yawm. And then he said, these actions no longer carry the consequence of a backlash from the international community. Instead, these actions may trigger condemnation, quickly followed by silence. So how do we stop his death being followed by silence? How do we create a campaign? How do we do something in his name that hopefully protects journalists like Jamal in the future? When my colleagues at Al Jazeera were thrown in prison, and they and I were convicted of terrorism in Egypt, we looked to the journalists of the world to create a campaign, and they delivered. Boy, did they make some noise. Right across the world, they got behind the campaign to try and get the guys out of prison. We also looked to the West. We looked to the governments. British government, pretty useless. The White House delivered. Obama was there at the time, and he sent John Kerry out, and every meeting they had with the Egyptian authorities at that time, he made some noise about our journalists. He did his damnedest. On the day of the verdict, I'm told his voice could be heard from one end of the embassy to the other when he heard we'd been given the guilty verdict. But they worked very, very hard on our behalf. And of course, in the end, we got the journalists out. But that campaign had something to rally for. Every day we woke up and we knew the boys were still in prison. We had something to shout about. If only Jamal had been thrown in prison, we'd be in that position today. But he wasn't. So what's our campaign now? How do we get behind his name to try and protect journalists in the future? How do we try and stop journalists self-censoring? When you're sitting in Turkey and you're thinking, what should I report or what shouldn't I? There's always that check at the back of your head that goes, what will the Turkish government respond in what way to this? As we did in Egypt. What are the journalists going to be thinking now? Not just the journalist diaspora that don't live in their country anymore because they can't speak truth, but report from other countries. What protection are they going to have now? And what are they thinking? Can they still report? We just heard that President Trump just today called the mainstream media the enemy of the people. That means that if the boys were in prison today in Egypt, they'd stay in prison, because there's no way President Trump would lift a finger or make a noise on their behalf. So our challenge isn't just to try and use Jamal's name in a way of protecting in the future, but it's also to recognise what's going on in our industry is having a trickle-down effect from the Trump mentality, if you like, and how that's permeating across the sorts of countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia to think that they can do this kind of premeditated, disgusting murdering and nothing will happen. If we can do anything in Jamal's name, maybe it's that. Maybe it's stopping the silence. And I'd like to leave you just with a take on a poem that was actually written about the Nazis. First they came for the journalists, and I did not speak out because I was not a journalist. We've no idea what they did after that. Thank you.